All right. We now are officially finished with week 4 in college football, but most importantly, we are now finished with our first official week of Big Ten head to head conference football play, where we actually now finally have a clearer picture of where these teams rank amongst themselves now that they've played head to head. And this is a power ranking. This is not based on resume. This is looking at teams, how well teams perform, and the eye test in these games relative amongst each other. So stay tuned, because there's a lot of teams that were exposed this week. And there are some teams that were better than what we thought they were. So there's been a lot of movement and changes in this week's power ranking. And to kick off our list, we're going to start with the bottom tier teams in the Big Ten. And at the very bottom of the bottom tier teams, at the very bottom at number 18, I have the UCLA Bruins. And it should come as no shock, no surprise. And this took literally no thought to put them there. You look at them, they're 0-3. Their coach just got fired. They're that bad. And they lost to New Mexico. They got blown out by New Mexico. They lost to UNLV, and they got destroyed by Utah. So they lost to two group of 5 teams. It's hard to look at this team and consider them a Big Ten caliber team. It's just really hard. Their coach was obviously a disaster. Even though they looked like they improved last season, it looked like they had some glimmer of hope and maybe some momentum going into this season. It's for sure been more than disappointing if you're a UCLA fan. So, but they do have the rest of their Big Ten schedule ahead of them. So, I mean, they still have plenty to play for technically. But right now, this bye comes at a good time to see if they can pick up the pieces and rally behind their interim coach. I assume they're going with an interim coach right now. But looking at their schedule, their easiest games are against Northwestern and perhaps Michigan State. With the way Northwestern looked against Oregon last week, the way they were somewhat competitive in that game and they had somewhat of resistance, the way they look at the line of scrimmage, I don't see UCLA winning that game. Because UCLA up front is very weak, very soft. They're only, if there's any twinkle, any twinkling light on that team, it's they have a marginally decent quarterback. That's about it. Who's not going to be there after this season for sure. But they have Ohio State, they have Washington, they have Nebraska, they got Indiana, they have Penn State, they have Maryland. I don't see a win on this schedule. I think they're going to go 0-9 in Big Ten play. But we shall see. So at number 17 on the list, I have the Wisconsin Badgers. They played Maryland today and just got blown out. I think the final score is 27-3. It was not even close. They got behind really fast with really bad just mistakes and really horrible special teams play. I would say there's nothing good that this team does, but they're not super. They're not like super bad at everything. There's just nothing good about this team where you can look at them and say, well, this is their strength and this is what their identity is. I think that, under Luke Fickell, he wants a explosive offense, which they don't have. They don't have a competent quarterback play. Their starting quarterback is injured. Their backup quarterback is absolutely terrible. Well, that's one thing that's terrible, is their quarterback play. They're just a team that is kind of puts up a little bit of resistance. I think it's just in Wisconsin's pedigree to be a team that is never going to be a pushover. There's always going to be a little bit of physicality to them. They're always going to have somewhat decent defensive play. It's just in the identity of the program that's always been there. Nothing comes super easy against this team, but this team just doesn't do anything well. And any team that just executes well against them, takes care of the football, as the game goes on, it's just going to pull away from this team. I could see this team losing to Northwestern just because Northwestern is probably more physical than they are. And the only team I can see them beating right now is probably UCLA. Because UCLA is pretty pitiful as a program right now. So there's not really much to say about this team. It's really pretty boring to talk about this team. They got pushed around by Alabama last week. They looked somewhat respectable, but I think every game they play, they'll probably lose by like 2 or 3 touchdowns, probably consistently. So I have this team now at number 17. So next on the list at number 16, I've dropped Purdue down. And it's the Purdue Boilermakers. I was not really sure about them through their first 3 games where they really lie in the Big Ten, because they looked actually really competitive against USC and really competent on offense, especially in the passing game. They looked really potent and competent in the passing game, and I was actually somewhat impressed. And they've looked really solid fundamentally, throughout their first 3 games. But I think looking at USC, I thought what they did was impressive, given what I thought about USC before they play Michigan State this week, is that they're a really, really good team and probably the 4th best team in the Big Ten. But I think their secondary did get exposed and as being pretty suspect, especially in the Michigan State game. So that kind of makes Purdue's performance on offense in the passing game not as good as it seemed. But I'll tell you what, they looked really competitive in that USC game, and they looked competitive actually against Notre Dame in the first 2 quarters. In that first half, if it wasn't for that kick return that Notre Dame had to open the game, they would have gone into halftime only down by 5 against Notre Dame. Before, of course, Notre Dame's talent really took over and they just ran away with the game and turned it into a really big blowout. But that's mainly because, really, it's not because Purdue isn't playing good football, soundly and fundamentally and are not well coached. They're well coached, I think. If there's anybody that can turn a program around quickly, UNLV's former coach. Because what he did at UNLV was really impressive. He took a team in about 2 or 3 years from a perennial nobody into a contender. A team that was one win away from making the playoffs last year. So I think if this guy can get some bodies on his team, because granted, he came into Purdue and had to shuffle around and scramble around and fill his roster really fast with transfer out of the transfer portal and replace a ton of players that were gone and left. So really, this is really, even though Purdue, I think they're one of the bottom teams in the Big Ten, and they got destroyed by Notre Dame, the fact that they were competitive in the first half and the way they've looked throughout most of the beginning of the season is a good sign of what's to come, because the issue is not the coaching, it's just the bodies. They just need to start upgrading their roster, and that will take time. But as they do, I think they're going to get better and better, and they're going to become, I think, trouble for probably a lot of teams in the Big Ten to come. So next on the list, I have the Northwestern Wildcats, and I've moved them up quite a bit from where I had them at the very bottom after week 1, because they lost to, granted, Tulane is a good program, but a group of 5 team by 20 points. They got blown out. So at first, I had a question. Even though David Braun had a really good first season and he was able to rally that team against all odds and expectations and surprise everybody and bring that team to 8 wins his first year after Pat Fitzgerald's unceremonious firing, I had a question about, is this going to be just a typical Northwestern team where you have a coach that cannot overcome the recruiting limitations of the program? Or is this going to be a Pat Fitzgerald 2.0 where they become a very fundamentally well-coached, very physical team that performs above their talent level? Right now, it looks like they could be trending in that direction, because I'm looking at this Oregon game. And Oregon is not by any means weak in the trenches. They're not a liability in the trenches. But Northwestern, I believe Northwestern was just that good in the trenches versus Oregon just being suspect in the trenches. And that is, if you're a Northwestern fan and you're looking at Northwestern, that's very encouraging because Northwestern was dominating the first quarter until they turned the ball over and allowed Oregon to settle into the game and do some explosive plays to kind of grab hold of the game. This is very encouraging looking at Northwestern. They outrushed Oregon. I'm not going to say dominated the trenches, but they won the trench battle, I think, in this game. And they were dominating the trenches in that first quarter. And they were able to run the ball a lot on Oregon. I feel like if Northwestern hadn't turned the ball over early, this could have been a much different game. It could have been a much tighter game for Oregon. So I think Northwestern is trending in the right direction. I don't think they're a middle-class team, but in the trenches, they got that down pat, and I think they're going to be a tough out for most of the teams that they play this year. And I don't think David Brahm's first year is necessarily a fluke. So next up on the list, I have the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, and they played this past Friday. The Iowa Hawkeyes looked like they were in control late in the game. They were up 28-24. And it looks like they're pouncing on Iowa. It looks like they've taken total control of the game. But like so many of Iowa's victims, they failed the test. They failed the discipline and resolve test, especially on special teams. And they had a key, costly turnover like so many teams do against Iowa in the fourth quarter. And all of a sudden, that 4-point lead with about 5 minutes left, all of a sudden, at a blink of an eye, Iowa capitalizes, and you look up at the scoreboard with a minute left, and they're down by 10 points, 38-28. And that's what really happens, though. If you are not vastly more talented than Iowa and you do not play well on special teams, they had a blocked field goal kick and an inexcusable kickoff return. So that's what happens if you do not execute on special teams and you do not take care of the football, especially in crucial moments against Iowa, and you do not have the resolve and you do not execute well enough and do not have the discipline. Really, this is not a middle-class team to me. I think if you're a middle class in the Big Ten, they're not a middle tier team, Rutgers. And it doesn't really matter how close the game is against Iowa. Iowa is not a team that's going to blow you out if you're bad. They just don't. They just either win the game or they lose against most opponents, unless they're a top tier team. But against any middle tier team and any team that's not real talented, they're just gonna beat you by winning two phases of the game. That's special teams and that's defense. And they also won this game, I think, at the line of scrimmage. So it's not like a good moral victory. It's not like a good indictment on Rutgers that they had Iowa in their grasp and they just lost at the very end, because they have a lot of issues. It shows up against a team like Iowa. Their special teams play was pretty horrid. Their play in the trenches was actually not very good. They became one-dimensional on offense. And their one bright spot was Kaliak McManus, who, by his standards, had a really good game. He had some really nice throws down the field. He flashed and impressed. And has really grown, I think, quite a bit as a quarterback since he's left Minnesota, surprisingly, because I think he's been a terrible quarterback for most of the time I've watched him. In the trenches, they really failed. Defensively, they gave up 160 rushing yards and only ran for 70 yards. And yeah, it's just a recipe for failure against Iowa. And looking at the makeup of this team, I just don't see a team that's going to really compete with the middle part of the Big Ten, with teams like Nebraska, teams like Minnesota, perhaps, probably Washington, teams like that. I don't really put them in that class. Just looking at their trench play in this game, how it got exposed. But we shall see. But for right now, I think they're a higher, lower tier team. All right, so next on the list, I have the Michigan State Spartans. That's Sparty. And they traveled to the Coliseum in LA to face the USC Trojans on the road. And I think the score, looking at this game, I think the score was a bit of a mirage. They lost only by 14. The way the game looked, it looked like they got dominated by much more than what the score was. But primarily, I think that's more of an indictment on USC than what Michigan State did. Even though Michigan State, I think, does have a somewhat impressive passing attack. I think Marsh is a real deal. I think he's a Sunday player. And Aiden Childs is taking a step forward this year, as I've mentioned before. Although he still has inconsistencies at quarterback. But a lot of their big plays came on just defensive breakdowns from USC, and that's more as an indictment on them, I think, than anything else. That kind of kept Michigan State sort of in reach in the game and kept the game interesting. But really, looking at this team, they're really only a strength and the only identity to really build off is their passing attack. Their O-line and their D-line is still a major issue. There's really not anything else that this team does good. And in fact, most of their position groups are liabilities, especially their offensive and defensive lines. They're not very good at running the ball. They're not very good at pass protection. Against Boston College, they gave up a ton of penetration, tackles for losses in that game. So I do not think that they're a middle-class team because they just have too many liabilities. And I think their passing attack will keep them in a lot of games and make a lot of games interesting. Probably when Michigan travels to East Lansing, that game will, make me very, very, very nervous and stressed out because given how Michigan's secondary has communication breakdowns, that game will probably make me nervous with Michigan State's explosive passing attack. But other than that, that's like the one real thing that they're good at. And I don't think they're built for success against really, most Big Ten teams in the trenches that are on their schedule. So next I have the Minnesota Golden Gophers. And this is the hardest team to rank. They were idle this week. So there's very little data points to go on with this team. The only significant data point to look at is their loss to Cal. A game I don't think they should have lost, a game where they kind of let the game slip away because they were -2 in turnovers, and I think that was the biggest deciding factor, the deciding stat of the game that is the reason for their loss. Because they dominated the line of scrimmage, I thought, in that game. They only held Cal to, I think, 61 yards. They didn't rush real well in the game. They rushed for 130 yards. Another thing that's really interesting is Cal lost 34-0 to San Diego State yesterday, which does not look good on the resume for Minnesota. The fact that you lose to a team that's actually not very good. And Cal, and after the game, you kind of wonder, is Cal good? They must be good this year. Well, they're not. They probably aren't. They're just probably a typical Cal team. And losing to them is just not a good indictment on Minnesota. But the other thing that's really tricky about this team is they're good at the line of scrimmage, eye test wise. They've looked really good at the line of scrimmage, and their running back room is stacked. And they still got Darius Taylor coming back, and their passing game is better than it has been since probably about 2019. Under Mr. Row the Boat. So this team is just real difficult to rank. I just have them a little just outside of the middle class right now. Although I think they're built the way they're built. I think they're probably a middle class team. The way they're built, the way their line of scrimmage is, their QB play is, and their passing game is more competent than it usually is. And then you have the best running back room in the conference. So they look like a team built to to survive and be competitive in the Big Ten. But I'm looking at this Cal game and looking how Cal lost to a group of 5 team 34 to nothing. It just doesn't look good. So for right now, I'm going to keep them right here, but we'll have to see where they end up. So now we are going to get into what I consider the middle tier of the Big Ten, or you could say the middle class of the Big Ten, and I'm going to give Maryland the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to sneak the Maryland Terrapins into this category, into this tier. They're 4-0, and they just went on the road at Camp Randall Stadium. Yes, it's against Wisconsin, which I have ranked really low. But they still went into Camp Randall Stadium, which is a tough environment to win in the road, and they handled business and they dominated Wisconsin, and they won 27-10, but it was really 27-3 until Wisconsin scored in junk time. Take away that last drive of Wisconsin, and they held Wisconsin to well under 250 yards of total offense. So that's pretty good defense. They only held them to 61 rushing yards, which is pretty impressive on the defensive side. But on the flip side, they only rushed for 61 yards. So their trench play is still in question. But before I get to that, I'll say their quarterback play looks really good. Their special teams looked spectacular in this game. And Wisconsin's not a good team in any of the 3 phases of the game. But they definitely capitalized, and they definitely looked impressive on special teams, and they look good on defense. So I think this is a team, looking at their schedule, they only have Penn State and Michigan on their schedule as teams that can really, I think, give them a lot of trouble in the trenches. So that they could get through this year and get away with not having their trench play tested in a way that they cannot get more than 9 wins. They could get 8 or 9 wins this season, I can see, with their schedule. And it's very much possible. I think their only games that are not winnable are those 2 games I mentioned. Well, we shall see how Maryland does this Big Ten season, and if Mike Locksley can actually take this program a step they haven't actually been before, which will be really interesting. Okay, next on the list, I have the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And they played Michigan today, and they lost 30-27. Going into this game, we did not really know. A lot of people really did not know how this game would turn out. Michigan was only a 2.5 favorite. A lot of people had Nebraska, and a lot of people had Michigan. It was kind of split, it seemed, within the sports media world. And a lot of that's because Nebraska has a really good secondary. They look fundamentally sound, and they're beating up on really bad teams, but beating up on them really well and looking really well doing it. And Dylan Raiola looks really like an elite quarterback. And he definitely proved that he's one of the best quarterbacks in the Big Ten, I think, today. But one thing going into this game, that if you were to scout the team, one thing that that looked like a potential weakness on the team that could be exploited, and that is an issue, seemed like it could have been their trench play on both sides of the ball. It looked like Cincinnati had a lot of success running the ball against them, and it looked like they got a lot of penetration from Cincinnati, into the backfield. And that really did come to fruition today. Looking at this game, if you were to put this game into context, there was a Hail Mary in the game. Michigan kind of shot themselves in the foot, gave up a lot of third and extra longs. Some of that's on Wink Martindale, and a lot of that's just on some defensive breakdowns in the secondary that aided Nebraska. So if you were to actually look at the game, put it into context, Nebraska got beat by 2 or 3 possessions. I think that's really the separation between the two teams, because their trench play, it definitely got exposed big time. And looking at them, they're a team that has a lot of strengths, though, beyond their trench play. That's Dylan Raiola and mainly their defensive secondary. And those two things kind of can keep them in a lot of games, I think, this year. I think I do not have their schedule in front of me, but I'm certain that there's going to be a handful of teams where their deficiencies in the trench is going to be too much to overcome. But there's probably going to be a handful of teams in the Big Ten where it's not something that's not going to be too much of a detriment that they won't be able to overcome. And a lot of that's because Dylan Raiola is able to just, when things break down, he's able to extend plays. And not really, like with his legs where he totally escapes the pocket. He kind of reminds me of Russell Wilson, the way he maneuvers in the pocket. Just his pocket presence and his footwork and the way he just maneuvers around it. Like he doesn't just look to escape the pocket. He looks to move to like an open space in the pocket, and then he finds a receiver. And that's really dangerous. He can gash a lot of teams with that. Put that in their defensive secondary together against teams that are not real strong in the trenches. They can win a lot of games against those teams, and they could probably stay in a lot of games this year just because of Dylan Raiola and their secondary. So it's kind of hard to determine where this team is going to end up this year. I could see them winning 3 games in the Big Ten. I could see them winning 6. So probably somewhere in the middle where they have 4 or 5 wins, where they're likely, probably, if I were to guess, they're going to be 7-5 or 8-4. This is a team that's definitely a middle-tier Big Ten team. I think they are. I think it's getting a bit more clear. It's a little bit more clear now. And I think they're definitely not an upper-tier team. Far from it. They could be, it's possible that they could be like an upper-middle-class team, like a high mid-tier team. But I would say they're more likely kind of middle of the pack right now. And this is why I kind of have them ranked where they are right now.